Today's topic, I want to put some context around that on regulatory issues. It wasn't much more than a little over a year ago, we could all take a look at our newspapers, and virtually every day there was a new kind of story about dangers that the public faced, whether it dealt with contaminants in our medicines, whether it dealt with unsafe food products, from meat to spinach to many other kinds of food products, all the way to worker health and safety, dealing with mines and cranes. The list went on in what we saw. And that's not to even mention the financial meltdown that we saw. Many people chalked this up to a number of factors. Among them were the fact that we have what many people dubbed paralysis by analysis. That is, many hurdles that agencies had to go through in order to get a regulation done. Others chalked it up to a whole change in atmosphere where politics superseded science, that science integrity was placed second to trying to address political agendas. And of course, that led to many people, good people, leaving government. Some people commented that the cop was literally off the beat. Enforcement was pushed down as a priority. Voluntary standards were placed up as a much higher emphasis. And of course, with all of that, there was also a seeming appearance of special interests having pretty much access over the public interest, and that government was serving those kinds of concerns. The effect of all this was a regulatory apparatus that many people chalked up as very similar to a weakened government, a hollow government, a government that couldn't even respond in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and people were concerned about the regulatory machinery of government. Add to that mix, at the end of the Bush administration, a host of new regulations came out. They were dubbed the Midnight Regulations. They covered a range of issues, from women's issues to health issues to public lands issues. It was an enormous array of regulations. Many people, including organizations such as OMB Watch, called on President-elect Obama to both address the Bush Midnight Regulations as well as begin addressing the flaws and the weaknesses in the regulatory apparatus. Well, I do think it's a little unrealistic to look at the Obama administration and say, has everything been fixed and everything done in year one? That's a pretty big agenda. By the same token, today's panel seems to be about right to give some kind of a benchmark or assessment on how we're doing in moving forward and making government more responsive to public needs. Now, people have all kinds of views on this. Just this week, on February 1st, the New Republic published an article called The Quiet Revolution, and I'd like to quote from it because it took an assessment on the regulatory machinery of government. It said that the Obama administration isn't simply improving the effectiveness of various government offices or making scattered progress on a few issues. Obama is resuscitating an entire philosophy of government with roots in the progressive era of the early 20th century. Taken as a whole, Obama's revival of these regulatory agencies is arguably the most significant accomplishment of his first year in office. I'd like to put that test to the panel that we have today. We have 4 experts. We have experts from my left going further down. We have Pamela Gilbert, who will address as a consumer advocate issues around consumer protections. We have Wesley Warren, who is an environmental advocate and addressing environmental concerns. We have Peg Seminario, who deals with worker rights and will address worker health and safety. And then finally, we have a representative from the administration, Michael Fitzpatrick. I will introduce each of them in a moment. A few ground rules. I will ask each panelist to have a short presentation, and then I will follow it with some questions to try and create a dialogue among the panel. In addition, I invite all of you, both in the room and through the webcast, to ask your questions after that. For those of you outside of the room watching this on the internet, you can ask your questions or put your comments to us through an email at questions@ombwatch.org. That will appear periodically on your screen, questions@ombwatch.org. Send us your email, put your name. If you have an organization you're affiliated with, put that, and put what location in the country you're from. and I'll be sure to try and get those questions before our panel. I will also ask for those of you in the room to hold all applause or boos or other forms of expression that you may have. I think what we'll do is make sure we give a hearty round of applause to our panelists at the end, but for now, let's hold back on that. Let me start with Michael Fitzpatrick. Mr. Fitzpatrick is currently the Associate Administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB. That's a mouthful, but what Michael does is he is a key player in the development of regulatory policy for the Obama administration, and he helps with doing the White House review of significant executive branch regulatory actions. He's not new to this. He has worked inside the administration back in the Clinton era. At that point, he worked for the same agency, OIRA. He also was an assistant United States attorney. In the intervening years between working in the Clinton administration and what he does now, he was a partner in Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. And I'm pleased to have you, Michael. So,
thank you, Gary.
Why don't you start?
I will start, and it will not come as a surprise to anyone watching or hear that we heartily agree with the conclusions in the New Republic article. Peg knew I was going to say that. But we really are genuinely excited with all that has been accomplished in the first year. Having worked in 2 administrations and been born and bred in D.C. and being a political junkie, I think that oftentimes the least understood, the least appreciated impact of a presidential administration is what happens in the regulatory state during what is usually an 8-year tenure. And as I look back on what happened in the Clinton administration and as I look at what we've done in the first year of the Obama administration and going forward, I'm confident that at the end of it all, you can compare with legislative achievements, you can compare with other policy initiatives. It's the total accumulation of regulatory actions over time that I think has the most profound impact on the American people, both good and bad. And I think that the first year of the Obama administration is an example of that. I think that it is one of the signal achievements of this administration that it has sort of turned the regulatory supertanker substantially around and has it heading in the right direction and has achieved a lot already. I had a few slides that I was going to run through quickly that I think will provide some illustration of what's been done this year, and then of course I'll be open for questions after our initial comments. Over the first 11 months of the Obama administration, so for calendar year 2009, we reviewed 553 significant regulatory actions. The OMB, OIRA, only reviews significant regulatory actions. There are many thousands more that are issued by the agencies without centralized review. Of these, most were rules that were affirmative rules going forward, but a decent chunk of them were rules that were withdrawn as a result of the Emanuel memo, the now ubiquitous order that goes out at 12:01 on Inauguration Day, which freezes the regulatory state and I think appropriately gives the incoming administration a chance to take a breath and review what's in the pipeline. Of these, 115 of the 553 were economically significant, and if you all, and this would be a crowd that might want to do this, you can drill down into the data on reginfo.gov. The average review time is, I think, impressive. We have strived very hard in the first year to not be any more of a temporal impediment to rulemaking than is necessary to do our jobs under the executive order. We also, as you know, have a statutory responsibility under the PRA. But with respect to executive order reviews, we came in at the end of the first year with an average review time of 32 days for economically significant rules and 40 days for significant, and that is the best average under this executive order. We had the benefit of only having 1 year, whereas, of course, Clinton had 7. But this has been a pretty big year. The number of rules falls within the general range of, a consistent range of 500 to 700 a year, but the rules have been ambitious and complex. These have not been a lot of run-of-the-mill rules, and so the issues involved have been challenging, And I think we are all very, very proud of these review times, and I can tell you our staff has worked immensely hard, including late nights and weekends, to try to accommodate ambitious schedules by the agencies. It will not come as a surprise that the principal rulemaking agencies were EPA, HHS, USDA, DOT, and Department of Commerce, which would principally be NOAA, NIMS, those agencies. I will not go through these individually, but I wanted to throw up what we view as some, but not all, of the signal achievements in the first year. Some of these are final rules, some of them are proposed rules, all of them are moving through the process or are already in effect. But as you'll see as you scan down this list, there are some very substantial rulemakings that will or are protecting the American people. There's a second list here. I mean, the HIV entry ban, for instance, was a huge achievement in the area of human rights that took some hard work, but the administration was able to get it done by the end of the last calendar year. And then I have a list here, and this will be made available to anyone who wants it, of rulemakings that we think embody some of the new ways of thinking in this administration. Concerns with incorporating behavioral economic ideas in rulemaking, using open government and information to achieve social good and regulatory ends, taking into account distributional effects, effects on future generations, and frankly, principles of fairness and equity. And I will be happy, I have other examples on these two little pieces of paper here, but as we get into our conversation, I'll try to take an opportunity to weave some of those into my responses to questions. And with that, Gary, I hope I came in on time.
Absolutely on time. That's impressive. If we can only move regulations along as fast as that.
I just showed you we are, but
I have a few.
you have a few, right?
When it comes to worker right to know, ergonomics, other key health and safety, job safety issues, there's no one more knowledgeable, more strategic, more of an advocate that I could ever know than Margaret Seminario. Peg is the Director of Occupational Safety and Health at the AFL-CIO and has been there since 1977. She's worked on a range of legislative and regulatory issues. She's been involved in international safety and health issues. She serves on numerous panels in the government, scientific panels and other types of panels. She's been the architect and lead organizer for the annual event in April 28th of Workers' Memorial Day, which is concerned about workers who have been killed, injured, or distressed. I had the honor of working with Peg in a campaign to stop the anti-regulatory efforts during the Contract with America phase. And I can tell you firsthand that she is a tremendous advocate and enormously skilled. And so I'm really glad you're here, Peg.
Oh, thank you very much, Gary. It's great to be here. Spent numbers of hours in this room that we're in now dealing with a whole host of regulatory issues, and as Gary said, back to the dark days of the Contract on America with Leader House Gingrich and others taking direct aim at the basic protections that workers and the public had. So it's good to be back here during much, much better times. In the area of workplace safety and health, which is where I've worked for now more than 3 decades, we really do think that there's a real opportunity to move forward in a way that we haven't in many, many years. To understand where we are, I think you have to understand where we've been, and that was for 8 years under the Bush administration, a very anti-regulatory administration. In the worker safety area, they started early in the administration in March of 2001. The first major piece of legislation that President George Bush signed was legislation repealing OSHA's ergonomic standard. Very first one that he signed. A very first piece of legislation that President Obama signed was the Liddy-Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, and so I think it gives you a sense of that there really has been a change in direction. But we went through 8 years in workplace safety and health with essentially the regulatory process being shut down after repealing rules, dragging the agency's feet, refusing to move forward basically any hazards. The only things we were able to get them to do were things that were a result of congressional directive or court challenges. And so there were almost no rules that came out to protect workers for 8 years. So we start from a very big hole here, trying to move forward, things that haven't been addressed for 8 years. We also start with agencies at OSHA and MSHA that we've lost talented staff, and so there's been a lot of erosion. And so there's a lot to rebuild from to get moving again. OSHA is doing that. The people that have been appointed are, competent, dedicated worker safety and health advocates, starting from the Secretary of Labor on down, with Hilda Solis as Secretary of Labor. One of the first statements that she made after being sworn in was to make very clear to workers and to employers that there's a new sheriff in town, and we intend to firmly and forcefully but fairly enforce the job safety law and other labor laws. So at OSHA, there is a ambitious regulatory agenda, but at this point it's dealing with things we should have dealt with a decade ago or before. So the things that are on the list as priorities for us are a standard on silica, because we still have workers dying from silicosis in this country. A rule on cranes and derricks, because that standard is 40 years old. And you may have remember a couple of years ago we had cranes literally falling out of the sky off of buildings in New York and Nevada and Miami, killing workers and killing members of the public. And so there are those kind of basic hazards, but they've got to deal with hazards facing pandemic flu for healthcare workers who are exposed, hazards coming from other chemicals in the workplace. So there's a lot of work to be done. And while we have new leadership and we have a commitment, a very firm commitment by the Obama administration to move forward in these areas, we still have a very cumbersome, very slow regulatory process. And when I started this work, the preambles of OSHA standards weren't very big. It was, big rules took 2-3 years to get, out of the process. And here we are now with the preambles on rules being hundreds, if not 1,000 pages long, trying to fend off any potential, objections from the industry. And we also have a process which has added many requirements, whether it's through additional requirements on legislation. OSHA, like EPA, is subject to a special requirement for small businesses to have a special say on rules before the process even gets going. So my concern is that the process is too long, and so can we get done some of these important rules, which some of them are just at the starting gate right now. And so one of the things we'd like to talk about with the administration is speeding up the process and removing some of the hurdles that have still been added, were added by Bush, and are still in place. One other point, and that is the issue of resources. As folks probably heard last week, the president announced that there was going to be a discretionary budget freeze for all of the non-defense, non-security related issues. I'm happy to say that in this year's proposal, fiscal 2011, that the workplace safety agencies and I think other regulatory agencies did relatively well. But they're under that cap, and that freeze is supposed to last, or that cap is supposed to last for, another couple of years after 2011. So there are real concerns about whether the resources will be there to actually bring some of these rules forward and get them over the finish line. And I'll just close by saying, again, doing this work for a very long time, and what I've said to many people going through many administrations, that at the end of the day, that what you can count and what matters is what's in the Federal Register, because it's law, and it's very, very hard to undo those things. It's the people that you put into place, because again, once you're in the federal government, in a position, a career position, good people there, they stay there for a while and they do a good job, and the budgets you put in place to basically build the foundations for these agencies. So those are some of the things that we're focusing on putting in place and firming up during these next couple of years. Thank you.
Thanks. The next speaker is Wesley Warren. I had the opportunity to work with Wesley as a co-author of, along with 15 other people, of creating a report of recommendations around regulatory reform that we gave to then President-elect Obama. And I can tell you that Wesley has lots of ideas. He's a great observer of what is happening. What is interesting about Wesley is he has had experiences inside government and outside government. Inside government, he worked at the Office of Management and Budget as an examiner. He also worked at the Council for Environmental Quality. He worked in the Congress for a number of years. He is now a key player at the Natural Resources Defense Council as the Director of Programs, where he really leads, has a responsibility for strategic planning, coordinating across the many different program areas within NRDC, and working with programs and departments to implement major campaigns. Wesley?
Well, thank you, Gary. I appreciate that introduction and really everything you've done to educate me on regulatory policy over the years. I want to start by, I think, echoing some of the introductory comments, talking about the incredible change in philosophy that this administration has brought to the task of governing, especially in contrast to the previous administration. So I'll try to describe that philosophy as an observer in terms of their actions and give some examples that I think fit those observations. But I have to first start by contrasting it with the philosophy of the previous administration, which I believe was one that felt simply that the market was right and that government intervention in the market on the face of it was not likely to be right. And therefore, there was an overwhelming burden of proof that had to be met before you could justify federal intervention through regulatory policy. Well, the fact of the matter is, all regulatory proposals have strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons. And because in many cases that the pros greatly outweigh the cons, that you're actually doing a disservice to the American people by not putting those regulatory protections into place, that you're really shortchanging the people who you should be protecting. This administration has brought that philosophy, I think, to bear by saying, this is a matter we want to get just right, not too much, not too little, because where we need it, it's very beneficial. In my area, environmental policy, even under the Bush administration, they would publish an annual report by OMB, and it would document the overwhelming benefits, according to their calculations, which were often loaded, the overwhelming benefits of those regulations compared to the cost. So imagine what we could have done if they hadn't meanwhile been trying to block or rescind one regulatory policy after another. So when this administration came to office, they really took the approach of saying, we're going to get it right, we're going to use science, and I would also agree, we're going to put people into place who have this philosophy who are going to make it happen. And they really have put some exceptional appointees into place. Cass Sunstein, who Michael works for, is one of the most astute regulatory experts on this subject in the country. Carol Browner and Nancy Sutley, who advise the President on environmental policy, have successful experience at really every level of government. The President's science advisor, John Holdren, is really an outstanding expert on science policy, renowned expert. And that's just the White House. The cabinet is also just loaded with talent. So these people are carrying out a philosophy of using regulatory policy to actually protect and benefit the American people. On environmental issues, plainly their hallmark has been trying to lead America into a true clean economy future, which is, I think, by far the biggest environmental challenge that we face, not only in the U.S., but globally. And they understand that achieving that will result not only in less pollution, but more jobs and greater security. That we can wean ourselves from dependence on foreign oil over time while actually rejuvenating the American economy and creating technological leadership. Just a few of the actions they've taken in this area to back it up is first ever greenhouse standard for automobiles, which was negotiated with the auto industry last year, a legal finding that greenhouse gases endanger the health and well-being, welfare of the American people, which will pave the way for additional regulatory action. And if you've ever had that little light bulb go off in your head, well, in fact, they issued a rulemaking on light bulbs that will actually save more money for the American consumer than any regulation on energy efficiency that the Department of Energy has ever issued. So this is a sample of them going forward in this area to accomplish what they can. I grade them on the curve a little bit on energy and climate policy, only because they can't control all the actions that need to be taken. They've sent a visionary, far-reaching measure to Congress, which Congress has not yet passed, that will set the limits on greenhouse gases and provide the incentives to get us the rest of the way down this clean energy path. But within the power of what they can do, they've done what they can. Let me mention two other areas quickly, because I think it rounds out this philosophy that it's not just a one-off issue. Health, they realize that the environment is where you live, and the quality of that place affects your health very much directly. And as a consequence, really have looked across a wide range of regulatory policy on environmental health, with Lisa Jackson, the administrator of EPA, in the lead, looking at matters like atrazine and perchlorate, which is a threat to drinking water, and mercury emissions from power plants, which the administration had tried to weaken, and the courts rejected, and now this administration is moving forward with. And the last area I would mention is natural resource policy. The President has called on his cabinet to put together a plan for governing our fragile and threatened ocean resources, and we're expecting that plan to come out this spring. So really you see across the board the adoption of this philosophy, and we really give them great marks in the first year.
Thanks, Wesley. Let me remind the viewers that we are still taking your comments and questions at questions@ombwatch.org. I've already received a few. I'll try to incorporate those as we move along, but don't hesitate to send us your comments or questions. Our last speaker is Pamela Gilbert, who is a partner in the law firm of Cuneo, Gilbert, and LaDuca, based here in D.C. Her firm fights for consumers, businesses, and workers. She has been actively engaged in tools of litigation, lobbying, public advocacy. Pam heads up the lobbying practice of the firm, which she joined back in 2002. I've known Pam as a tireless consumer advocate for more than 2 decades. I first met Pam back when she worked at U.S. Public Interest Research Group, U.S. PIRG, and also dealt with her when she moved over and worked for Public Citizens Congress Watch. She, during a good portion of the Clinton administration, was the executive director of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the independent agency that deals with various kinds of regulatory protections on consumer products. In the years since leaving the CPSC, she was the Chief Operating Officer of M&R Strategic Services, which deals with grassroots lobbying and other kinds of strategic policy initiatives. Pam?
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. That was a very nice introduction. I, too, am delighted to be here and to be in such great company with my fellow panelists. I'm going to talk mostly about the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and I'll start by agreeing with my fellow panelists. I have to give the Obama administration very high marks with where the CPSC is now 1 year into the administration. Like Peg, though, I need to bring you back a little bit to the Bush administration in order to explain why we in the consumer advocacy community are so very excited about the direction that the CPSC is taking right now. I've been either advocating for product safety or during the Clinton administration actually worked at the Consumer Product Safety Commission for about 25 years. And I have to say that the agency really reached its depths during the Bush administration. It was just a horrendous time for product safety protection in America. And just to, I don't want to go too much into history, but I just have to tell you, even from the very beginning, when President Bush came into office, his very first nominee to be the chairman of the CPSC went down in a committee vote, a party line 10-9 committee vote in the Senate Commerce Committee. That was the first Bush nominee to go down, even by the Democratic Congress. But that's how they viewed how bad that nomination was. The next person who came in to be the chair of the CPSC was Hal Stratton. His nomination did go through, and he was confirmed, and he was the chair for about 4 years. But I have to tell you, even he made no secret of the fact that he sought a, I think, more important job in the administration than the chair of the CPSC, and really ran the agency with neglect would be a nice term for the way he ran the agency. When he left in 2006, the next Bush nominee was a guy who used to lobby for the National Association of Manufacturers, and when it was revealed in the New York Times that NAM was going to hand him a $150,000 severance package to then go to CPSC and regulate NAM's members, he withdrew his nomination. From 2006 through until President Obama came into office, the CPSC was run with an acting chair, a Bush nominee named Nancy Nord, and one Democratic holdover from the Clinton administration, Thomas More, who's actually still at the agency. That left 2 commissioners running CPSC for 2.5 years, 2 to 3 years. That for most of that time, the agency didn't have a quorum. Even when they had a quorum, the 2 sitting commissioners couldn't agree even to meet, let alone to vote on anything affirmatively. So the agency was essentially just gliding by, doing very, very little, and then the firestorm hit that most people remember in 2007, what's been dubbed the year of the recall. And millions and millions of children's products that were beloved in many people's homes that bore names like Dora the Explorer and Thomas the Train and Barbie were found to have lead levels that sometimes were 200 times higher than the lead levels that under law that were allowed. This drew, as you can imagine, tremendous public concern, congressional concern. It was a very, very big issue, and we were faced with an agency that had an acting head who didn't really much care for the mission of product safety, and was also fairly incapable of reacting. And her reaction to this firestorm was very defensive. She blamed the media for making a big thing out of nothing. She blamed parents for being overly concerned about what she deemed to be not really a great hazard. And there was outrage. There was bipartisan public outrage, and there was bipartisan congressional outrage. And the reason this was important to go through this history for you is because it actually led to the most significant legislation on product safety that had been passed by the U.S. Congress since CPSC was founded in the early 1970s. And so this was, while President Bush was in office, there was a very strong product safety law that was passed by Congress. 3 senators voted against it, and 1 House member voted against it. That's how popular the concept of re-energizing this agency was. And the legislation that passed in August of 2008 is the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, CPSIA. CPSC was never very good with very catchy acronyms, so we're stuck with it. But the CPSIA really made tremendous advances for the agency. The budget went from $80 million a year, which I know sounds so small to anybody who deals with government budgets, but such as it is, that was the CPSC's budget. And then the level in the CPSIA would bring it up to $136 million a year by 2014, which for CPSC, it was an extraordinary gain. And so far, those increases, those step increases that are established in the law have been coming to pass, which enabled the agency, of course, to hire a lot more staff, to get a new lab, Most people remember the stories about the lab and Bob the toy tester. So that is that's getting improved. And in addition, there were strict lead limits that were put in the law, more authority for the agency, a public safety database that was required for CPSC to create that would allow consumers to look up specific products on the internet and to find out about consumer complaints. That has never existed and will be up and running, I think, in 2011. The law also increased civil penalties and gave the agency in general a lot more authority. But what happened in August 2008, Nancy Nord was still running the agency, and she in fact had opposed many of the provisions in the legislation that ultimately passed, and she essentially slow-walked the implementation of the legislation. And so enter President Obama at the beginning of last year. And unfortunately, because of CPSC's statutes, he couldn't change the leadership of the agency without a full-blown nomination and confirmation. So that the agency, unfortunately, did languish for about half the year in 2009 until President Obama's nominee to be the chair of CPSC was confirmed in June, and her name is Ines Tenenbaum, and she came in to the agency and she did a press conference on her first day on the job. Well, that showed change just in and of itself, because the Bush agency shied away from the press because their press coverage was never good. Chairman Tenenbaum really hit the ground running, and she's been doing a great job. And so what we've seen since she's been there, and it's only, again, been really since July that we've had this change in leadership. The first thing is that she is very visible. She's very proactive. She's been visible both at the agency in meetings and bringing the stakeholders in and meeting all the various stakeholders, industry to consumers to experts to state officials, to get their input in what the agency is doing and to really have a give and take. And she's been on TV, and she's been putting the product safety message out there, which really has been quite dormant for about 8 years. She has shown a very strong commitment to the implementation of the CPSIA. She has announced that she's going to meet all the deadlines, that she's incredibly committed to the goals of the law and to getting it implemented, and particularly is focusing on the product safety public database, which is very, very important to the consumer advocacy community. She started a new rulemaking on sort of the new generation of ATVs that are called ROVs, which is significant because CPSC did very little rulemaking in the last 8 years, and in general, as an agency, hasn't done a lot of rulemaking, and so that's a significant new one. And in general, she's been very quick and aggressive in reaction to product hazards. She is not shy about going out and putting a message out saying, for example, children should not be playing with cheap jewelry because we just found cadmium in jewelry that came over from China. And even though the agency doesn't have a rule on cadmium, even though they don't necessarily have a regulation or a level that would be safe or unsafe of cadmium in jewelry, she said, you know what? Don't let your kids play with it until we figure out what's the story is and can give you better guidance. She's erring on the side of safety, which is again something that we haven't seen for about 8 years. We're very excited to have Chairman Tenenbaum and the other new Democratic Commissioner Bob Adler at the agency. They've been doing a great job. And just to end with what we'd like to see a little bit more of, and I'm sure it will come as they get their sea legs, is perhaps a little more creativity in the use of the tools and the authorities that CPSC already has to actually get even quicker reactions to product hazards than we've seen in the past.
Thanks, Pam. Appreciate that. We're getting many questions and comments from those of you on the internet. Again, keep them coming at questions@ombwatch.org. I'd like to start, this has been more or less a love fest. All of you are laudatory about what's been happening. Of course, you've all used as a baseline the Bush administration, including you, Michael, used in your graph numbers. You included the Clinton administration, too. So I hear what you're all saying, that the ending of the revolving door. We've got good people. We have an ambitious agenda. But I jotted down 4 things of concerns that I want to get you to react to. One is we've had good people, but they've been coming at very slow rate. What effect is that having? The president committed to doing an executive order and had an innovative process of involving public input, but that hasn't come. Has that made any difference? We had a promise of principles on scientific integrity. That also has not yet come. Does that make a difference? And then, Peg, you raised the spending freeze on domestic discretionary. Although you said that the budget looks good for some of the regulatory agencies, this is going to have some impact, and I'm curious about that. So within all the positives, I'd love to hear any of your reactions to these things I've heard about that might have other points of view. Michael, it looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I just first want to say you couldn't leave well enough alone, huh, Gary? I think 2 of those were probably implicitly or explicitly directed at me. I'm not going to comment formally on the confirmation process, although Sally Katz and I have written a little bit on staffing of agencies and how important it is to have the president get his or her team in, and I certainly think it is critical. And on the resource issues, again, done a little writing on that. It is absolutely critical, and I think so far the president has done within the fiscal constraints that are being presented to him as much as he possibly can, and he's committed to it. But with respect to kind of your overarching idea about EO and scientific integrity principles, let me try to address those specifically, but also take a step back and talk about what's embodied in those a little more broadly. I think that the President Obama's approach to regulation, which has been affirmed in several written statements by him and other oral statements, I think focuses on strong and rigorous analysis. So you've got very strong analytical underpinnings to these very important rules, which are intended to do great social good, and a strong consideration of various alternatives so that we're clear at the end of the day that the choices that are being made are the right ones. A deep respect for science and scientific integrity, a premium on what one might call smart regulation, which is you can achieve, I think this is tied into alternatives, you can achieve social goals, but there are different ways to get there, and you want to try to make sure that you're doing it in the smartest, most effective way possible. And also a real emphasis on openness, participation, collaboration. What we've tried to do throughout the year is open up these processes as much as possible to public input. And so in the areas of the Paperwork Reduction Act, with the executive order, on cookies policy, on open government itself, and many other areas, we have actually gone out to the public and said, and I think in an unprecedented way, tell us what you think. We want to benefit from your comments. In the area of the executive order and the reg review process in general, we did that for the first time ever and have received and reviewed carefully all of the comments. There were many, many comments, and met the timetables of the president's own memorandum in terms of ideas. But it is true that there is no new executive order at present, and I would say just a couple things. One, there is an awful lot on the plate since last fall through now. There have been huge issues that are being grappled with, and there's been a lot of regulation. We don't forget that has been coming through, and so the process continues, the thinking continues, but I think there is an acknowledgement. I would hope there's an acknowledgement here, and the record speaks for itself, that the current process is working pretty well, and I think we have also learned an immense amount from the comments and conversations that we've had. So many of the things that the president was talking about, the relationship with the agencies, open government, consideration of distributional effects and future generations and fairness, incorporating new ideas in behavioral economics like default rules and simplicity in regulation that makes things easier for the people to understand and react to, are things that are already being implemented in regulation. And if you would indulge me, I was just going to point out a few examples of this, even while you wait anxiously for some embodiment of perhaps in a new executive order. But distributional considerations.
You're not going to announce it right now.
No, it's not, unfortunately. This isn't going to be tantamount to the Lost premiere for the regulatory groupies. Distributional considerations. Let's just take the Knox-Nax, which was recently published, or the SOX-Nax. That entire approach is supported by an environmental justice theory. The EPA is going out with a new approach to monitoring, which is cutting edge, and there is a fair amount of uncertainty around it, but it is going forward, and we're going to learn from experience. But it is fundamentally an environmental justice rationale that underpins that. And so you've got these roadside monitors, which tend to be located among populations that are at-risk populations or disadvantaged populations, and you have an additional 40 monitors which can be placed at various hotspots or appropriate points around the country by regional administrators. That's all a concern with distributional impacts that is animating that. Social cost of carbon, for which there has been an interim number arrived at through a consensus-based effort in the administration, and hopefully more to come on that. That employs a global cost of carbon, not a domestic cost of carbon, and it also employs a 3% discount rate as opposed to a 7% discount rate. That accommodates both impact on future generations in the use of that lower discount rate, but also a fairness concept in using a global value as opposed to domestic, because the greenhouse gas emissions that we emit in this country, I think it's hard to say, only have a domestic impact. That they, if we believe they have an impact, and we do, some don't, but if they do have an impact, it's surely a global impact, right? It doesn't stop at these amorphous borders. And I don't want to belabor the point with open government, because I know you had Norman here, and there's so much, we could have a whole session on open government, but in the behavioral economics area, there have been a lot of interesting new proposals to both use information to achieve regulatory ends, but also to use new default rules. So in the auto-enrollment, which the President has spoken a lot about for retirement savings, using an opt-out methodology will ensure that many, many, many more people will actually get the benefits of savings rather than an opt-in approach. The flip side of that is in credit card protections and overdraft protection, which actually became a concern of mine just a week ago. There was a problem whereby if you overdrafted, you would get a $39 charge, for instance, on each subsequent transaction in short order once you were in a default situation. And so you could go out and buy a pack of gum and a newspaper and a latte, and for that $15 that you spent, you might have accumulated $120 in overdraft fees. Most people didn't realize how that worked, and so what the Fed Reserve has done is to institute an idea of an opt-in as opposed to an opt-out. Again, that is using concepts that are animated by behavioral economics to achieve social ends that are beneficial, but just understanding that we're dealing with Homo sapiens and not Homo economicus. So that is, those are the ideas that we think have begun to animate regulatory policy in the Obama administration. We continue to want to have a very open and vibrant dialogue on these issues. And on the scientific integrity principle specifically, I can't speak to that necessarily because that's not really an OMB issue at this point. But I will say that I will stand by our record over the last year and the agency's record in terms of respecting the science that is underlying these regulations and, frankly, having robust science underlying the regulations.
Any of the other panel
Yeah,
speakers?
just a comment. I mean, I think that the biggest constraint that we face is time and resources right now. Again, I don't think the requirements that are imposed on the regulatory agencies for developing and issuing major significant rules are enormous, and even the requirements on the small rules are big for, across the board, and then there are certain agencies that have these additional requirements. And unless there is some way to cut through those, streamline them, create certain presumptions, cross-utilization here, I am really, really concerned about the ability to produce rules that are actually on the books, protecting workers and protecting the public. And so that, concerned that we don't end up where we did at the end of the Carter administration, the end of the Clinton administration, with numbers of rules coming out in January in the Federal Register that were summarily stopped, reversed, killed by the subsequent administrations. And so I think that is a really important concern. I would say and encourage the folks at OMB and OIRA not to focus so much on new EOs and process and all that, but on results. And I think you are. I think focusing on getting things done, because if you don't get them done, so what, And we went through a lot of time in the Clinton administration reinventing government and all that, which at the end of the day, didn't do a whole lot in terms of adding to protections. And so the time issue is one, and then coming back to the issue of budget. This year, with the cap in place, again, the regulatory agencies did okay. But OSHA is sort of back to where it was in fiscal 2001, sort of real dollar terms. You keep a cap in place on that, they're back to where they were. The high point of OSHA, looking at numbers of people on staff and resources in real dollar terms, what they were doing was the Carter administration, both in terms of standard setting and enforcement. And we have a workforce that's almost twice as big as it was back then, and OSHA has 600 fewer people than it did, in 1980. So those are key issues here that I think need to be looked at and need to be addressed.
Both of you also wanted to comment on it. Wesley, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to talk about the scientific integrity issue. And I think the question is here is, can you disagree with someone on the science and yet not have that disagreement because they're corrupt and you're not? And I think that we have, in the environmental community, found ourselves at times in that situation. So to be fair to the administration, who, as I said, we give high marks overall, there have been some cases where we think they fell short on the science. For example, the Department of Interior, I think it's the tale of two departments. On one hand, the Secretary is very visionary about wanting to move the department away from the old extractive industries of the past to renewable-based and recreation-based organization. But he's allowed Bush administration rules to stay in place on protecting certain types of wildlife, like wolves and bears, for example. We don't think that's supportable by the science. They left it in place. Mountaintop removal, a deplorable environmental practice that can't be mended, needs to be ended. The administration, at the beginning of its term, pulled back a number of permits to review them, are still reviewing some, have modified others, but they've allowed a number to go forward. But just at the end of last calendar year, a major scientific panel came out with an indictment of that practice that I think proves our case. So does that mean that the administration hasn't quite caught up with the science? Is it our job to convince them of that and their job to listen? And I think that you can have an honest disagreement of that sort that can cause a change in policy over time. So ultimately, they will be judged on their results. I think more successes than not to begin with. That could change over time. But do I believe that's what's necessary? I don't see the evidence at this point that what they need is some reform in their integrity, while at the same time I support them following through on their commitment to lay that commitment out.
You can go on to the next.
Yeah, by the way, I have so many questions myself because
Right.
this is such a exciting panel, but I've gotten so many other questions, and so I'm going to go to those, and then I will, at the same time, invite those of you in the room to come up to the microphone here and ask your questions or comments. This question or comment is from Professor Douglas Amy, who is with the Department of Politics at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. Could the panelists explain a bit more how the Obama administration is using cost-benefit analysis which the Bush administration often tried to manipulate to undermine regulatory efforts. That's a big one.
Big one.
Good one.
And we could probably spend the rest of the time just talking about cost benefit.
Yeah.
But if any of you have a strong opinion or thought in a short amount of time, I'd love to hear it, as I'm sure Professor Amy would too.
Sure.
I'd love to hear Michael make it clear.
Yeah, I'll start on that one
Yeah.
as well, since we live that among other things. I work with someone named Cass Sunstein who's had a thing or two to write and say about cost-benefit analysis. And it is one of the important factors that is applied during the interagency review process of significant rules, but not the only one. What Cass and I have been talking about is a concept of, and I don't want to hear Twitters in the room, please, but of humanized cost-benefit analysis. You restrain yourself. And it is a serious one, and it is this. There is a role and a place for the analytical rigor that occurs when you try to quantify and, if possible, monetize both the benefits and the costs in a decision or with a decision, behind a decision. And that is something that adds an analytical rigor to very important decisions that have very real impacts on people's lives, on the economy, on jobs, on public health, on public safety, on our quality of life. It is one factor that is in play when one analyzes a policy decision, which is a rulemaking, but not the only one. And what Cass and I and our office and really the President in choosing Cass and in reaffirming this process have made clear is that there are other factors to be considered that include qualitative or non-monetized benefits and costs. It is often the case, very often the case, that you just can't quantify or you can't monetize all of the benefits or all of the costs. And let's take, for example, the HIV entry ban that I suggested or as a signal achievement of this administration. The CDC, with our assistance, did an extraordinary analysis. You go look at it on regs.gov, estimating the real costs and benefits on society that would come from admitting people who are HIV positive into the country, down to point estimates in terms of health effects. However, that by no means it was the driving force behind that rule. There was a very strong concept of fairness and human rights that was animating it. And that was articulated in a very clear way in the regulatory analysis that underlay the rule. That is just one example. There are others, OPM rules dealing with sick leave and long-term care insurance policy, which now for the first time have opened benefits up to federal employees who have domestic partners. So what we have tried to do is to create a concept of cost-benefit analysis that, as I said earlier, deals with the fact that human beings are human beings and they don't all act according to sort of the neoclassical theories of economics, but also doesn't discount the idea that there is real value in trying to ascertain what are often real costs on society of various actions and, frankly, real benefits to society of these same actions. I would note, as Wes has already noted, that at the end of the year we publish a cost-benefit report to Congress. And I think every single year what the report shows is that in the aggregate, the benefits, quantified benefits of the rules that are issued by any administration, including the last administration, outweigh the costs. And that is the filter that we use. So I hope for the professor that was at least a partially a responsive answer, and I'd be happy to follow up on it.
Others?
Yeah, just to say that this is an issue that gives us some heartburn in the area that I work in, because we have an underlying statute, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which puts in place the requirements and the legal standards by which the agency is supposed to set standards, and that is to protect workers against a significant risk to the extent feasible. And so it's a different test, and Supreme Court decision saying, at least on the health side, that cost benefit is prohibited because you've basically put in place a standard. You don't balance the cost and the benefit. You protect people against significant risk to the extent feasible. And so one of the questions here is, again, looking at rules, and again, you don't want stupid rules, you don't want unnecessary rules, but adding on analytical requirements that are not required by the statute and of cost resources, there's no question about that. And what it does sometimes, it really skews judgment, because you get into this balancing where you're looking at the data, and you may not have data on a lot of these things. And so the numbers don't mean a whole lot. And you're asking the agencies to make determinations and try to quantify things that can't be quantified. And again, getting away from common sense, and particularly in the area of safety, as opposed to health. There's a lot of codes, there's a lot of standards, best practices that exist. Lockout tagout is an example of a standard. It was issued by OSHA back in the 80s. Hazardous equipment, people go in to do maintenance on it, that it needs to be essentially de-energized so you don't get caught and crushed in the machine. Big debate, should it be a lock, a physical lock, or could it just be a tag or a warning? Well, how do you make the determination as to whether a tag, whether a lock? I mean, but practically speaking, it's like if you lock it out, you know, you can't operate the machine, which is what you want. But so in my view, that I think one of the things that's happened here is, you know, analysis for the sake of analysis has gotten people away from just some common sense, and that it would be useful to have people step back and look at taking things that, again, are best practice, that are applied, widely applied, and try to apply them more broadly, and not require necessarily all this analysis to get those things put in place. And that's not to say that there may not be some places for cost-benefit analysis, but I think it's gotten way, way too much focus and taken people away from just really some common sense approaches to putting things in place that really should be done.
Anybody else want to add anything on cost-benefit, or?
Can I just respond to that briefly? I mean, this is
Before you do,
yeah.
I want to just see if anyone wants to
Oh,
add,
yeah,
because
no,
you may
no
have
problem.
more to respond to.
Well,
Thank you. Yes, you may have something to say.
Well, I would make this comment. I think that this administration has been much more judicious in the application of cost-benefit
agree.
analysis than its predecessor, and that's been to the good. Even this administration, though, I would recommend to take great care in their application of it. And I'll give an example. You mentioned a 3% discount rate instead of a 7% discount rate for actions in global warming that affect future generations. Well, for those of you who are number nudges, take 3% and run it out for 100 or 200 years at an annual rate and see what you end up with any value. You're dealing with an equity issue, future generations, long time horizons, really requires a completely different framework, I think, to analyze. And I recommend for consideration this administration that in this case, the precautionary principle, which is basically it's better to be safe than sorry, is the one that we should be applying, and in other areas as well.
And I think I heard that from Pam in her opening comments about the safe than sorry. I would just add maybe to the question as you go to respond, and then we need to move on. I think what I've heard from others, and it didn't quite come out in this question, is how the cost-benefit tool has become near decisional in the agency or the OMB's review, as opposed to simply another tool. Peg raised the issue about resource allocation when it's not even required.
Where it's prohibited.
I don't know if I would necessarily credit that characterization. I think it's, we review, as I say, 500 to 700 rules a year. Each one is its own sort of unique transaction, and I think in many cases, especially in those areas that are well established, where costs and benefits are permitted to be considered, it can be a very important factor. I think in others, it's not as important, and there are many instances in which the rigor of the analysis that ends up being required is not the same for one rule as it is for another, and that we make those kinds of balancing decisions all the time with each transaction. I respect what Peg says and what Wes says, and I think this is a very valid discussion and even debate sometimes that has been going on for many decades, and I expect it will go on for several more. I think we're probably closer to inhabiting the same island now than perhaps we have been in many, many years. I don't think that because one uses, say, cost-benefit analysis, one necessarily doesn't make common sense decisions, or that we require agencies to quantify things that can't be quantified. I think that there is much common sense that can be embodied in the analytical rigor that comes out of doing this kind of analysis. And I can assure you that we take great pains not to require agencies to quantify or monetize things that they legitimately say cannot be. I would end by saying that the issue about whether this should go on at all, where there are statutes that require that decisions be made without consideration of cost, is a very interesting one. I think, first of all, the decisions have been made in those areas, say the Clean Air Act and in some of the OSHA contexts, without ultimately a determination, a cost determination. But there is a real value that many believe that one gains from having, both in Congress and in the American public, an accounting of what are the social costs and benefits of these rules. If Congress has chosen, as is its prerogative, to require that costs not be considered in a regulation, that's fine. But there's also a value to society to having some sense of what that actually may be imposing on society, both in the good and the bad. So I think it's a discussion that we'll probably continue to have over the years.
Let's take a question from in the room and then go back to the online. Why don't you say who you are and who you're representing?
Good afternoon. I'm Francesca Griffo. I'm the director of the Scientific Integrity Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And thank you, Gary, for giving me the preamble for what I'm going to ask. I appreciate a lot of what's going on here, and I have about 1,000 questions, but I'm going to condense it into 1.5. I think as I listen to you, I hear, the notion of the tension between let's get the rules out versus let's cogitate on how we do it. But I'm also hearing you say that we're doing it right. We really are. And I guess I just wonder if you are doing it, whatever right is, but right in the sense that we've been discussing it, why not just write it down? Why not have it out there so that we can see what it is and what the process is that's going on? And the half question to go with that is, as we look back over the last administration, a lot of what we see are these cultural norms that are what we really want to change. Mm-hmm. And I guess when you institutionalize something in an executive order and have it out there, that's when those norms begin to change. And that's when we can think about how do we prevent this in the future. We've got 4 years, hopefully 8 years. We'll see how it goes. But certainly at some point, we will be going back. And our only hope for prevention in the executive branch that can happen within the executive branch is to really create these cultural changes. So I'm wondering why we're not seeing, the science as it leaves the agency before it comes to OMB. I'm not accusing anybody of doing anything wrong with it, but it's just these habits of the mind that will eventually prevent problems.
Sure. Well, there was a lot packed into even those 1.5 questions, Fred. That's okay. And I would say this. First of all, we do think that by and large we're getting it right and have gotten it right over the first year. I do not want that to be interpreted as us thinking that we've done everything right or have gotten it precisely right, because I'm sure we haven't. We do the best we can under a lot of pressure with a lot coming at us. Changing cultural norms, that is, I think, a very important thing, and it's something that we have worked hard to do. My personal theory, this is my personal theory, is that at the end of the day, what matters, you have national elections for a reason, and you have very different ideologies of government from administration to administration. At the end of the day, the senior policy officials at the agencies and at the executive office of the president, from a top down, are going to dictate which way we're going. And they will create whatever processes, written instruments, etc., that they feel they need to accomplish the goals that they're going to accomplish. I think the current executive order is actually quite an achievement in that it has survived through 3 administrations now. And I think it points to the fact that it's more the people involved and the approach of the president and his administration than the instrument itself that I think is the big is the difference. We have tried very hard in this first year to try to reset relationships with the agencies, with our staff, with their staffs. We have a job to do, and we take it very seriously, and we try to do it very well. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a respectful relationship with the agency, that we can't appreciate their timelines and their imperatives, that we don't look for the right way forward and the right way out, and that we don't forget that we all work for the President of the United States at the end of the day. And so Cass and I have gone to agencies, we've met with staff and senior policy officials, and I think by and large have achieved a lot in trying to reset everybody's default assumptions with each other, because over 8 years there was a lot that did build up in sort of a Pavlovian sense that we're trying to reset. I'm not going to try to dodge your last question because, I mean, your first question. I'm mindful of the time, and I'll talk to you about it afterwards. Opening up the entire reg review process, which has been talked about for many years, probably by you among others, is a really interesting concept with a whole host of complications. And I think that to create a process in which literally everything that is being said and exchanged in what is, in essence, a deliberative administration process could, I think, create an inability to have full and frank conversations about what's going on. And at the end of the day, the process is there to make sure that the rules are accord with the law, accord with the President's policy agendas and prerogatives, and are coordinated between many federal entities. And I can tell you, I can't name them specifically because it would be improper, but there have been scores of examples in the last year even where rules have been fixed so that they would not be overturned in the courts, where agencies have actually coordinated. Look at the announcement yesterday on energy between the Ag, Energy, and EPA rules. Those all went through interagency review, and they managed to come out in a coordinated fashion with a presidential announcement. So in my view, there's a real value to this sort of take a second breath, look before you leap idea of central review, and to open up the entire process transparently could actually take out the value of it. Let's continue this conversation afterwards, because this is a very, very hard issue.
I'm going to squeeze in a few more questions. I'm going to ask for brevity now. And I'm going to focus this one, even though it's always easy for the administration to respond to all of them, I'm going to focus it on you, Pam. This is from George Mason University's Richard Williams. On the one hand, the President has expressed concern over federal spending, that we must control it as we reach historic debt levels, which will ultimately have to be paid for by American taxpayers. While there may be important issues to deal with through regulation, costs of those regulations will also be passed on to American consumers. Will or should control over regulatory costs also be part of the administration's agenda?
It's an interesting question, and my real brief answer would be no. I look at these issues from my prism of experience of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I don't think the CPSC has ever issued anything where the benefits didn't way outweigh the costs in any way that it was looked at. All I can say is I think in 2007, we all witnessed what happens when the regulatory cop is taken off the beat. And the American public doesn't like it. It doesn't matter what party they are in or where they live in the country. They don't want to feed their pets food that are going to kill their pets. And they don't want to feed their children food or give them prescription medicine that are going to harm or kill them because they're contaminated. And they certainly don't want to give their toddlers plastic toys that the kids put in their mouths that are going to give them lead poisoning. And the public looks to the government to prevent precisely those kinds of things that you cannot prevent on your own. You can't look at pet food and know that it's going to be harmful to your pet. Somebody else has to do that for you as a consumer. And that is precisely, just like we look to our government to have police protection on the street, we look to our government to protect us from hidden hazards like that. And I think that the government at its peril, shortchanges the regulatory process, either through by restricting the taxpayer money that funds these agencies, or by looking at the quote-unquote regulatory costs of these kinds of protections at its peril, because it always will come back to haunt them, and then it's too late to throw money at the problem, which is what often happens. But that's too late for a lot of consumers, not only for the people who get injured, but for the trust of consumers in their workplaces or in their marketplace.
And now I'm going to read 3 questions from 2 reporters from BNA, and I'm going to read them so that the person I'm going to ask is for coming up with a brief response, very brief. The first part would be to Peg spoke earlier about the lengthy OSHA rulemaking process. What specifically should be done to amend that process? And is the administration making any effort to move in that direction? I suppose this goes to you, Michael. Two other, one dealing with regulations.gov, that the American Bar Association released a comprehensive report with recommendations suggesting basically a, quote, do-over. Report cited problems with the website's design. Bottom line, has OIRA taken any steps to implement some of the ABA's recommendations, including putting the website on a more firm funding base? Along with that, there is concerns about OIRA's position regarding a recent Congressional Research Service report that had numerous instances of agency failures to send proposed rules to Congress as required under the Congressional Review Act.
That's not Ralph Lindemann, is it? Hi, Ralph.
Question really with that is, has OIRA taken any steps since the report was released in December, or does OIRA have any plans to take steps to address the problems outlined in the report? Peg?
Well, it's a good question. It's going to be hard to answer it really briefly because there's so many parts to the rulemaking process that I think you have to look at them. And what we've asked the agency to do and would ask OMB to do is to look at these processes here and to see where the resource sinks are, both with respect to people and time, and then to look at what value is added by those things and how do you shorten it. And how can you actually do some of these things perhaps concurrently rather than sequentially. Because right now, things are going to go through this process where they just get added on rather than collapsed and being done at the same time. And one example of that is the directive out of the Bush administration on peer review. I mean, OSHA's got a very lengthy public rulemaking process where everybody gets to come, they testify, you can cross-examine people, et cetera. It really is sort of a public peer review. Why not allow peer review to be occurring after a proposal is issued during that time, which takes forever anyway, and so you're not eating up 6 months beforehand or whatever. So that's just one example. The other thing is to do what I said before, is to look at ways in which you can use certain practices, certain findings of other agencies, states that have regulated, made assessments, as either presumptions on risk or presumptions on feasibility. If things have been in place under a state law for 20 years at the state level in workplace safety, why isn't that a demonstration of feasibility that it can be done? So why do you have to require, the whole, full-fledged analysis? So that's...
And Michael, you might respond. We're 3 minutes over, so brevity.
Yes, brevity. Okay. Let me just say very quickly on the OSHA front that we have been meeting with agencies, as I said, and we've met recently with Labor and OSHA, had a great meeting with them. It's going to be a big year at OSHA, and we've already started conversations on how we can make the process run as smoothly as possible. So it's a great idea, and it's one that's already underway. On regs.gov, we are well aware of the ABA report. We meet with various authors of the ABA report to talk about it. I would say a couple things. One, regs.gov did go through one tranche of improvement last summer. There are more improvements in the works and some exciting new ideas on how we can make regs.gov even better over the next several years. And the funding issue is one that was getting very serious consideration. On the CRA issue, that was an interesting CRS report. It was some interesting reporting. I would say the following. This administration took the reports very seriously, and I think for the first time in many, many years, actually sent out to the agencies a reminder and a notice that there had been rules identified that had not been reported or had not been submitted to the Congress, and recirculated guidance that had been issued at the end of the Clinton administration. This may have been also the first time in many, many years which this had been done, to the agencies to remind them of their responsibilities under the CRA. It is the agencies who have the responsibility to report to Congress and to provide to GAO. We are currently discussing additional steps that we could take in the future to continue to remind agencies of their statutory responsibility in this regard. And so I would say stay tuned on that.
And the agencies may have forgotten because they didn't issue any rules during that time that had to go to Congress.
That sounds like the final word.
I want to thank all of you. It does sound very optimistic, as though the cop is back on the beat. I think we'll have to revisit this a year from now and really see where we're at. Let's give a round of applause for this great panel. And thank you again. Come visit us next week for the next webcast.